Well, good morning, OBC family, and thanks so much for choosing to be with us this morning. You know, a long, long time ago, there was a nation that had a king, and this king was regarded as being the greatest king in the world. He was strong, he was protective, he was wise, and he provided in every way for those people within his kingdom. The only problem was that this king was invisible. People couldn't see him. Sometimes they could hear him speak from a tent, but they couldn't physically see him with their eyes. And after a while, the people of this great kingdom actually began to despise their king. They looked around and they saw that kings everywhere of all the other nations, well, they were visible and they wore these majestic royal clothes. They had shiny golden crowns on their heads, and they had these mighty soldiers and chariots that looked fierce and powerful. So the people of this great nation of the invisible king complained to their leaders. And they said that they didn't want this invisible king to be their leader anymore, but instead they wanted a visible human king that they could see with their eyes. They wanted a visible human king like every other nation of the world had. Well, to their surprise, their king decided to grant their request. They elected one of their own, and they chose someone who was tall, and he was handsome, and he was strong. But as a result of them choosing this man to be their king, they now had to pay taxes to support their king's lifestyle and his army. They now had to bring offerings of food and clothes to this king and those people that were living in his court. And they now gave up their sons and daughters to be servants for this king. The daughters often became the cooks and the bakers, and some of the sons had to run ahead of the chariots, and often they were the first ones that would die in battle. And the people wound up having less than they had when their invisible king was their ruler. That story sound at all familiar to you? Well, to many of you it might, because it's the story from 1 Samuel 8, and it's the story of how Israel abandoned God as their king in order to have a human king like everybody else at that time had. And as a result of that, what they asked for and what they got was really much worse than what they had previously had. And you know, there's an important lesson in there for us. There's a lesson about being careful what you ask for, because you might just get it. And that's really what we're going to be talking about this morning. You know, we've reached week 6 of our Dangerous Prayers series, and so far we've looked at a prayer from the early church in Acts chapter 4. We've looked at a prayer from Numbers 21. We've looked at a number of prayers from Nehemiah. We spent some time looking at David's powerful prayer of restoration in Psalm 51. And last week, Adam talked about Paul's prayer for the church in Ephesus. Well, this morning we're going to spend some time looking at a powerful prayer that Moses prayed when he had reached the height of frustration with the so-called children of God. And this prayer is recorded in the book of Numbers, and I'd encourage you, if you have your Bibles there, to turn to Numbers with me. Now, there's a lot to love about the book of Numbers, but one of the things that I particularly appreciate about it is that it contains a number of prayers written by Moses that are very raw. They're prayers that are filled with emotion and questions and his own doubts, his own frustrations, and they're prayers filled with anger and disillusionment. And they're also prayers filled with Moses' own leadership insecurities. And if you've ever been a leader, maybe at church or maybe in your workplace, maybe at home with your kids or any place else, then this really is an important book for you to read. Because much of the book focuses on Moses leading the nation of Israel, and in many of its 36 chapters, we see him struggling to intercede between God and the nation of Israel, those people he was called to lead. And you get the sense when you read this book, and specifically chapter 11, which is the chapter that we're going to be focusing in on this morning, that Moses really does feel caught in the middle. He feels caught between what the people want and what he knows God wants in the lives of the people. And more often than not, Moses' prayers in the book of Numbers, they come across as a man who's really questioning his own leadership. He's questioning his own role, and sometimes he even questions his calling. To understand this passage that we're going to look at this morning, you really do have to understand something about the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers, as many of you know, is the fourth book of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the fourth of 5 books of what the Jewish people call the Torah. And the name of the book actually comes from the fact that it contains all kinds of different numbers. It contains statistics and population counts, tribal and priestly figures, and all kinds of other numerical data. The Hebrew name actually comes from the first sentence in the book, and it means in the wilderness. And that's likely the most appropriate name because the book follows the Israelites through its 40 years of wandering in the desert. The book begins at Mount Sinai when they are about a year out of being delivered from the Egyptians. And if you remember, it was on Mount Sinai that the Israelites received their laws and their covenant from God. And so the book starts at the foot of Mount Sinai, and then it ends with them on the borders of the Promised Land. The beginning of the book, the task that's sort of laid out before them was to take possession of this land that God had told them was already theirs. So in those chapters, the people are counted, the preparations are made for them all to move forward to that place. And the Israelites really begin this very long, tedious journey. But as we're also told, very early on in their journey, they begin to, as the Hebrew puts it, to murmur. They start to complain that their journey is hard. They complain that their life as God's chosen people is more difficult than they think that it should be. They complain that things are not comfortable. And they believe that as God's chosen people, that he should be taking better care of them. And they tell him that. And in their complaining, they grumble about God's provisions, and they grumble even about the God-provided leaders that God has given them, Moses and Aaron. And in this particular chapter, in Numbers chapter 11, Moses is facing a number of different challenges as the leader of the nation of Israel. When Numbers chapter 11 opens, we see very quickly that Moses' first problem is a people problem. I love the way A.W. Tozer writes about this particular passage. He writes that among those sins most exquisitely fitted to injure the soul and destroy the testimony, few can equal the sin of complaining. So starting at verse 1, this is what we read. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was called Tabbertha, because fire from the Lord had burned among them. So even in these first few verses, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we start to see that the people, they just weren't happy. They weren't content, and they wanted something better than what God was providing for them. After reading through the whole book of Numbers, I was reminded of Mark Twain, who once said, "The more I learn about people, the more I like my dog." And you have to wonder if that's not how Moses was feeling at this particular moment. Maybe it's ironic that they're called the children of Israel because throughout most of the book, they really are acting like immature children. And eventually, as you could probably expect, this really got under the skin of Moses. So the first challenge that Moses faced was a people problem, but the second challenge was a provision problem. And as we start to read on in verse 4, we learn that the nation of Israel had learned nothing from the incident that had taken place in the first 3 verses. Starting at verse 4 of Numbers 11, it reads, "The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing, and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." The manna was like this quenner seed and looked like resin. Verse 8, the people went around gathering it and then ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into leaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. When the dew settled on the camp at night, the manna also came down. And I love how one commentator wrote about this passage, because he says, Israel, having been ordered and organized and cleansed, separated, blessed, taught how to give, reminded of God's deliverance, given God's presence and the tools to advance to the promised land, is now on its march to Canaan, and immediately the people complained. And that's what they did. I mean, keep in mind here that Moses was leading roughly 2 million people through the desert. And if you think about it, that's an awful lot of mouths to feed, right? But every morning, they were miraculously given this manna as a provision from God. Every morning, they would wake up and find that, again, God had provided for them. They were told never to collect more than a day's ration because God wanted them to understand this very important fact. And that's that their utter dependence for life depended on Him. The other thing that's interesting to note here about this is that when the people first tasted manna, way back in Exodus 16, and I would encourage you to go back and read that, we're told that they thought at that point it tasted like wafers made from honey. And that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But day, after eating the same old, it stuck to their gut and started to taste like sawdust. Now, if Monica had been around back then, I'm sure she would have come up with all kinds of different creative ways to prepare it. I mean, they likely would have been eating manna waffles and manna burgers and manna bagels, maybe filet of manna bread. And I guess that even Bev, you could come up with a few more tasty ways to prepare that as well. But the point that I want to make here, and the point that I don't want us to overlook, is that there was never a day when any of the 2 million people would go hungry. There was never a day when any of God's people's stomachs would be growling before bed. There was never a day when any of the 2 million people would go to bed feeling anything but full. And all because God was the one that was providing for them. There's this wonderful ancient Arab proverb that says, "I complained because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet." And the children of God would have done well to have remembered that. In verse 4 and 5, the verses that we just finished reading, the people whined. And they said, "If only we had meat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost." And again, don't miss those 3 words at the end, at no cost. I mean, no cost, really? Could they have said something that could have come across as being any more ungrateful for all that God had done? They had forgotten that the cost was actually great. It was very great. Egypt had cost them the lives of their baby boys who were thrown into the Nile by Pharaoh's servants. Egypt had cost them the lives of their husbands and brothers who had collapsed under the whips of the taskmasters. Egypt had cost them their freedom. And I wonder, would they really rather choose slavery and oppression if it meant that they could get a different diet, maybe some spicy food? Would they really choose that over freedom and independence and being liberated by God? And it's here that we face Moses' third challenge. Moses faced a personal problem in verse 10. We read, it says, Moses heard the people of every family wailing in the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. Now just think about that with me for a minute. And I certainly don't want to simplify this, but the issue here that Moses didn't know how to handle really was criticism. Verse 10 tells us that every family was critical of him. Every family thought that he was doing something wrong. Every family was questioning whether or not he was really as close to God as he suggested. Every family felt that as if he wasn't representing them well to God. And Moses knew that this wasn't just a few disgruntled people, but this was literally everybody. And Moses felt weighed down by the load that he was bearing. He was grieved that the people were criticizing both him and God, and felt responsible for that. He had tried his best and given it his all, and look where all of that had gotten him as a leader. And as leaders, we know that that's just part of leading, right? I mean, whether you lead at church or at home or the place that you work, maybe it's that place that you volunteer at. Every time that a change is made, there will always be those people that will be speaking out against it. I mean, there'll be the people that will say, that will never work. We've never done it that way before. I think we're doing just fine the way we are. We can't afford that. I don't think we're quite ready for that yet, and maybe you could even add some other things to that. People talk like that when a change is presented. And it's hard not to take those things personally as leaders when the people that we're called to lead simply are not following us. And that's exactly where Moses was in this particular passage. Moses allowed himself to become utterly discouraged. In fact, the word in verse 10 that we translate into our English, most translations anyways, translated as the word troubled, really means broken to pieces and to be utterly destroyed. The end result of this was that Moses had a leadership breakdown because Moses allowed the problems he faced to become larger than the God that he served. Let me say that again, because Moses allowed here the problems he faced to become larger than the God that he served. And all of this leads us to Moses' dangerous prayer. And starting in verse 11, he really screams this at the Lord. And he says, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all of these people on me? Did I conceive all of these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all of these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." And I wonder, have you ever prayed a prayer even close to that? You ever been that raw and that hurt and that discouraged, that frustrated, that angry, that disillusioned, that you prayed like that? Moses starts out with asking 6 questions that really there's probably no good human answer to them. He says, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant?" He says, "What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath to your ancestors?" And then he says, "Where can I get meat for all these people?" But it's interesting because then he gets to the real heart of the issue. And God was giving the nation of Israel the daily manna as his way of letting them know that it was their God that was sustaining them and caring for them and protecting them and providing for their needs. God wanted the nation of Israel to understand that they needed to put their complete trust in him. And don't you sense here that in some higher level that this was a lesson that God needed to teach Moses too? In fact, you have to wonder if maybe God thought if Moses could ever embrace this idea first, then maybe he can help to pass this lesson on to the children of God. Moses says, I cannot carry all of these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. And again, I ask, as a leader, have you ever felt that way? In verse 15, he says, if this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin. And you really do sense that Moses was in every way at a breaking point here. He was at the place where he saw and felt his own inadequacies and his own weaknesses. And he confesses it to God and says, I just can't do this anymore. And maybe that was exactly where God needed him to be in that moment. It's interesting. A better translation of verse 12 would be, I am like a father attempting to nurse a child. And really what he's saying is you've given me a job to do, God, and I'm just not equipped with what I need in order to do that. And most of us know what he's talking about if we've ever been in leadership. We say things like, I'm ready to throw in the towel. I'm at the end of my rope. I'm at my wit's end, or I'm in over my head. And in verse 15, he prays, either get me out of this mess, God, or kill me. Well, God answers Moses' prayer, and God reminds Moses that he is not alone. God tells Moses that he's still his first choice to lead his people. And God invites Moses to be part of the solution. And the immature children of God are about to be taught a life lesson by both their heavenly father as well as their earthly father, Moses. And this is how God responds to Moses in verse 16. It tells us, the Lord said to Moses, bring me 70 of Israel's elders who are known to you as leaders and officials among the people. Have them come to the tent of meeting, that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take some of the power of the Spirit that is on you, and I will put it on them. They will share the burden of the people with you, so that you will not have to carry it alone. Tell the people, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, when you will eat meat. And I love that last verse because it's as if God is saying, if that's what the people think they need, then let's give it to them. But I also love that God is providing Moses with the resources that he needs in order to share the burden of leadership as well. Somebody once said that many of us are more capable than some of us, but none of us as capable as all of us. And that's very true, isn't it? I mean, instead of being the sole leader, Moses is now sharing the leadership with 70 other capable individuals. And it's not just the responsibility that's going to get shared around, but it's also the burden. It's the weight of leadership. And I think that the best leaders understand that. The passage goes on and it says, the Lord heard you when you wailed. If only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt, is what the people said. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. You will not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days, 10 or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? And again, let's not lose sight of the fact here that God is helping Moses in this passage, but he's also teaching the nation of Israel a very painful lesson. Moses is likely happy with the help, but he also realizes that these words don't solve the presenting problem, and that's that the people still want meat. And logistically, how is that going to happen? So Moses responds to God by saying this in verse 21. Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say I will give you the meat to eat for a whole month? Would they have enough flocks and herds if they were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? So it's interesting because Moses wants some specifics. He's looking for the logistics of how God plans to do this. He wants to see the spreadsheets. And this next verse is probably my favorite part of the whole passage, and it might have the most to say to you and I this morning. Because God answers Moses' question by first addressing Moses' deeper issue. Remember, that's the same issue that the nation of Israel is having, and that is an inability to trust that God knows what he's doing. Verse 23, the Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not I say I will come true for you." And that's such a great question that God asks Moses, isn't it? Is the Lord's arm too short? Are his resources just too limited? Is he just too busy to even care about his people? Is it too big of an undertaking for him to give them the meat that they're asking for? You know, much like God would give his children a king when they whined about that, and they said that they needed that, God answers their request for meat with an okay. If that's what you want, if that's what you think you need, I will give it to you. But it's not really what they needed, it's what they wanted. It wasn't really what they needed to sustain them, but they felt as if they were being shortchanged and they wanted some variety. So God agrees to give it to them. And as we start reading in verse 31, this is what it says. Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up in 2 cubits deep all around the camp. Now keep in mind that 2 cubits is equal to 3 feet high, or 90 centimeters. It says as far as a day's walk in any direction. That is a lot of quail, friends. And again, to put that into perspective for you, according to the Hebrew system of measurement, a day's walk was approximately 15 miles in any one direction. I can't imagine what that must have been like. I mean, quail were common birds back then, but the sheer quantity of them must have been horrifying to the people. And the way it's described, it really does sound like they're falling from the sky, just like hail. More than anything, I think that God wanted a bit of a shock and awe visual aid for the children of Israel. It's almost as if he's saying, you're questioning me? After all I've done in giving you manna, you're questioning whether I can give you meat? You don't think that I could give you meat if I wanted to? You don't trust me enough? You don't believe that what you eat is completely within my power? And in verse 32, all that day and night and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers, and that's about 60 bushels or about 40 gallons, if that helps you to put that into perspective. Then they spread them out all around the camp. Then comes the very painful lesson for the nation of Israel. Now comes the be careful of what you ask for, because you might get it. Verse 32 says, but while the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. What was really going on here, do you think? I mean, God wanted his children to understand that they could trust in him to meet all of their needs. God wanted them to understand that they didn't need to look beyond his provisions. God wanted his children to know here that his ways were far beyond their ways. Sometimes I think the best way that people learn is through giving them just exactly what they asked for. And that's certainly what God was doing here. It's also interesting to study just how many times God gave the slow-learning children of Israel what they wanted, even though it went against what was his best for them. Again, I wonder, do you think that we ever settle for God's second best? Do we ever choose our way knowing that we're leaving God's best out there? I wonder if maybe there's a part of your life right now where you're looking and thinking, I'm choosing my own way rather than God's. Isn't it something that God will at times give us that thing that we think we need, when really the only provisions that we truly need come from him? It's a tough lesson for the nation of Israel to learn. I pray that it will not be a tough lesson for us to learn as well.